Hey everyone, and welcome back to Joey's Retro Handhelds. I'm Joey, and today I'm going to help you set up your Anbernic RG35XX Plus, and pretend this is a 2024 as well, the H35XX, and the 28XX. Now, the reason that I've grouped them all up together is because they're running the same H700 processor, which means for the most part, the firmware between all three is kind of the same. There's some minor differences between them, but for the purpose of this guide and getting you all set up and running, you should be more than fine to just do anything in this guide for any of these models. For preparation, the first thing you're going to need is a branded SD card reader, since you'll be connecting the SD card to your PC. You're also going to need two branded SD cards, since you need an SD card for the operating system and one for the games. Now, it's possible that you got lucky like I did, and the operating system came branded. It's a Kioxia brand, which is Toshiba. So essentially, this is perfect. You don't really have to change anything if you got one of these. But if it's not, and it came unbranded, I would highly suggest that you swap it to a branded SD card. If you don't, they're very prone to failure, and you're going to find yourself having a bunch of issues, and then on top of that, the games have a bunch of issues as well. So you'll see across Reddit and social media, a lot of people complaining that Pokemon doesn't save. You're playing Pokemon Emerald, trying to save, it's not working. So you use save states. You get to the final end of the game where you have to save, and at that point, you can't because your saving doesn't work. And at that point, you just replace the ROM and it works, but just do it now. Why not? So that'll be a future thing. You'll talk about it a little bit later on in this guide, but just keep aware that the ROMs that come with this and the SD cards that come with these devices usually aren't very good, and it's suggested to replace them. Now, for the two SD cards, I would personally suggest a 64 gigabyte one for the operating system card, and either a 128 or a 256 for the ROM or game SD card. Dual SD cards is actually my suggestion for these handhelds specifically, as the operating system SD card can't be extended past 64 gigabytes. So, without using a modified stock OS, which does exist, and I'll leave a link in the description for the more technical users, for everybody else that just wants that full stock experience, you can't go past 64 gigabytes on the operating system card. So, that's what we're going to be using. And so this guide is going to go off the assumption that you're going to be using two cards, a 64 gigabyte one and a 128 or 256, but the second one doesn't really matter for size as far as the guide goes. As far as between 128 and 256, personally, I like to shoot high and go with 256, just in case you want to add more games and all of that. But honestly, with what this plays, you would be fine with the 128. But if you want to just have that little bit more room, and SD cards are pretty cheap nowadays, so go ahead and grab the 256 if you want. But like I said before, everything is in the description. I have links to everything in case you need recommendations and all of that. All right, so let's start. The very first thing we need to do is check to see if you need to update your handheld at all. Head to the Anbernic firmware download site, again in the description, and find your device's model. Click Download Now. Check the date of the latest update. It's kind of in the name. I can see that for the RG35XX Plus and H, Anbernic just released an update on April 28th. So that's the most recent for this video. The 28XX's most recent release is May 7th. One thing to be careful of if you have the RG35XX 2024 or the new 35XX as they call it on the website, you might scroll down and you might see an RG35XX in the firmware list. And if you click it, it's going to say RG35XX Dual System Firmware. Thanks to Anbernic's stupid naming conventions, this is actually the old RG35XX, the very original one. And it's not for your model if you have the new or the 2024, which is basically all they sell nowadays. As of this video, there doesn't seem to be a listing for it yet. I sent an email to Anbernic letting them know, so hopefully we see that soon for anybody that has that model. So now that you know what the most recent update is, we need to check your device to see what firmware you're on. On your device, head to Settings, then Firmware Version, and you might need to click into it if it's a newer firmware, and check to see if that date matches the newest update. Or you can check the version as well if it shows that. If you're one of the lucky ones on the most recent firmware, then congratulations, you have the easy way. You'll want to clone your SD cards to branded SD cards, like I mentioned before, if it didn't come with branded ones. And I also show a little bit later on how to replace the ROMs so you don't have to deal with lost saves or ROM issues and things like that. To clone your SD cards, it's actually very simple. I have a full written guide in my description, and it'll go through detailed what to do step by step, and it doesn't take very long at all, should be very simple for anybody to do. Then when you come back, you can just skip to the adding ROMs and BIOS section of this guide, because the rest of it doesn't apply to you. For everybody else that's unlucky and out of date, let's move on. I would highly suggest downloading that newest update from the website, which is as simple as highlighting the link, it's not clickable, and pasting it into your browser. Sometimes it's a Google Drive link, but recently Anbernic has been using WeTransfer, so just click download on that page. I should warn you though, especially for those of you that have data caps and other internet issues, Anbernic has been uploading the full 60 gigabyte file. And so if you have trouble with internet, this is going to take you a long while. You could choose to just skip the update altogether if you want, if that's your problem. But honestly, it might be just worth updating, especially if you're going to stick on stock, because they have done a lot of updates since the devices have released. Now, while that's all downloading, we can go ahead and do some other things. If you've already been playing the device previously, and let's say you have some ROMs that you've added, or you want to keep the ROMs that came with it, or you have some saves and you want to keep those saves, we can back all of that up. So let me show you how to do that now. If you're starting from scratch, you don't care most likely about all of this, but if you want to follow it along too, then you can. And we'll continue. Connect your SD card to the SD card reader. For this one, it'll be the second slot SD card if you have two, or the first slot if you only have one. You might get a bunch of pop-ups. Don't format the SD card ever. Just click no. It's just Windows not knowing how to handle the SD card format. So going forward, anytime that you pop in any of these SD cards or change them, anything like that, you're probably going to get errors that says Windows needs to fix it or pop-ups, things like that. Ignore all of that. Don't choose it. You should now see a ROMs partition in your PC drives list. And if not, open Disk Manager in Windows and assign a drive letter to that partition. Now, if you want to back up your saves, copy and paste any folders that you see here, and you can start with save or states folders that you see, and just copy them to somewhere else on your PC to back them up. Also, if you want to use the ROMs that shipped with the device, against my wishes, you can just copy the ROMs folder and back it up onto the PC. Lastly, I would also back up the BIOS folder, as there's nothing wrong with the BIOS files, and they're perfectly fine, so those I would bring with you. Honestly, you could just probably back up every folder if you wanted and you had the space on your PC, and that's probably easiest for most of you, but if you want to pick and choose, then pick and choose off of the ones that I just told you about. Once you back up that card, we don't need that card anymore, so if you want to put it to the side or chuck it or make a house of cards out of SD cards, the world is your oyster, but we don't need it anymore. Going back to that download of the firmware, once it's done, extract the zip file, and that'll take a few minutes. Head inside of the folders, and sometimes you have an option here. There might be a 16 gigabyte folder and a 64 gigabyte folder if you look at the names. You might be wondering, well, what's the difference? And I spent that time flashing them and looking at them to tell you what the difference is. And basically, the 16 gigabyte option is meant for 16 gigabyte cards. You can't extend the partition past 16 gigabytes. So, like I mentioned before, we are using 64 gigabyte cards here. Use the 64 gigabyte folder, and that's the one we're going to be using here. Jump into that folder, and now you want to make sure that you have 7-zip from 7zip.org if you don't already have it, and you want to extract the zip file that you see in the folder. Or it might be in a .zip format, in which case you can just use Windows to extract it, but most of the times it's been in 7z format for me. Once you extract it, you should see a .image file. Now, just connect your new branded SD card, the 64 gigabyte one, to your PC using an SD card reader. Or, if you're using a branded card that came with the device, we have to replace that anyways with this new update. There's no over-the-air updates, there's no way to just update on top and all that sort of thing. So we're just starting from scratch again, which means you'll be using that same card if it's a branded one, and you can just put it in now. Open Rufus, and it's included right there in the folder, and choose Select and navigate to that image file. Then click Start, and it'll take a few minutes. When that's done, safely eject from your PC. Insert the SD card into your TF1 slot on the device and turn it on. You're going to see an installing screen. Wait for it to finish and it'll take a few minutes. Once you see the home screen, you're all set and you're updated. Go ahead and turn off the device. Now, we want to use our second SD card for ROMs, so let's set that up. First, we need to format it to FAT32, so the device can see it. Connect the second SD card to your PC, and then just open Rufus. Change boot selection to non-bootable, and change file system to FAT32 or large FAT32, whichever you get the option for. Click Start, and then OK. Safely eject the SD card and insert it into the slot TF2 on your device, with the operating system card in slot TF1 still. Turn on the device and it'll look like nothing happened, but what the operating system just did was add all of the folders that we needed to that second SD card, so it's all set up. Just turn it off after you get to the home screen, and you can connect your operating system card to your PC now and delete any of the ROM folders from it if you want, since your ROM folders are going to be on the second card anyways. Doesn't matter, it just avoids confusion. You can skip this step if it's confusing to you, but just basically clearing out that first operating system card of ROMs, since it's not going to live there anyways. Once that's done, or if you're skipping that step, eject the second slot SD card and put it back into the PC. This is the 128 or 256 gigabyte one. At this point, it didn't automatically assign a drive letter for me. So, like the steps I showed before, open Disk Management, find the drive, right-click the FAT32 partition, and select Change Drive Letter and Paths. Then click Add. Give it a letter, and you should now see it under My Computer. Alright, so for those of you who backed up folders beforehand, pretty simple, just move them back. Not all of them, if you back them all up. I would do the ROMs folder, as well as any saves or states folders, and the specific BIOS folder that you'll see in a second. You'll see I have some folders on the right that I backed up, and on the left is our SD card. So move them over. For those of you starting from scratch, with your own ROMs and BIOS files, you can find the ROM system folders inside of ROMs, and you can put your ROMs inside of whichever system is matching the system folder. For BIOS files just go inside of the BIOS folder. Remember, don't just select all folders and copy them over, because you might overwrite some new settings and changes that have been updated since we backed up the folder. Okay, so remember before how I said you should replace those stock ROMs because of issues and all that sort of thing, and we're now at that point. I have a link to a video in my description where I talk about ROMs and BIOS files in a little bit more depth. Now that you know exactly where the ROM folders are, it's pretty simple. You should probably be able to find ROMs and BIOS files anywhere you want, although in this case you don't need the BIOS files. ROMs, just find them, and as you go along, replace them or put them in those folders, and that would be my suggestion. Or if you want to deal with possibly not having saves and all that sort of thing, then try it out and see how far you get. But anyways, once you move everything over, you can eject the SD card from the PC, and you can insert it back into the device and turn it on. You should see all of your games, and your saves should still be there as well. Everything is great, and life is great again. Okay, let's go over some quick tips and tricks for getting the most out of your device now that we've installed and updated and everything the stock firmware. The first thing that a lot of you might want is Boxart. So how do we get Boxart on this device? And there's no option to do scraping on the device. Despite the fact that two of these models have Wi-Fi, you just don't have that option. So we have to do it on the computer. I'm going to move pretty quickly through this because it's kind of an older tutorial, but the general idea: connect your ROM SD card to your PC, head to screenscraper.fr and make an account. Click Scraper at the top right, and then Download at the top. Download whatever for your operating system. I'm using Windows. Extract the 7Z file using 7-zip. Then, open scraperui.exe and log in using that screenscraper.fr account. Click Validate and then click Next. Let it download resources. It's going to take a very long time, but through the magic of production, we're going to skip all of that. Go ahead and click Generic Emulation and then Next. Now it wants to know where your ROMs are. So click the folder icon and navigate to your SD card and then the ROMs folder. You should see that it shows all of the systems that it finds here. And then you can click Next. Click Next again. And now if you look on the left, you're going to see all of the system folders that it found, regardless of which, if there's ROMs inside or not. So a lot of them might not have games inside either. It doesn't matter. But it's also possible it missed a few. For example, it likes to miss PlayStation for some reason. So how do we add systems that it missed? It's pretty simple. Click the plus icon on the bottom of the list, and then find the system in the list of whichever one that it missed, and then click that icon for it. Then just click OK on the bottom. Now you have to point to where the system is, so just on the right, you're going to see a game/ROMs folder. Click that, and then point to whatever system it is. So if it was PlayStation, find the PlayStation ROMs folder and click that folder name. Repeat these steps for any missing systems. When that's done, head to the left and then click All Settings. Go to Game List and change it to No Backup, just update existing. Head to Media and you can choose what you want scraped. I don't need the manual, for example, so I'm just going to remove that. For media type, internal mix, you can choose what you want. I'm just going to leave it as 4 images, but leave it up to you. Now for output folder, remove the media and images writing and just change it to IMGS. The way that you see it on screen is how it should be at the end. Once you're set, click the play button on the bottom right. Then click OK and it's going to run. This is going to take a very long time once again, a very, very long time. I would suggest doing this one system at a time, and you can do that by just clicking the system on the left and then clicking play. But it doesn't really matter. You can do all systems and then pause it and come back. It's going to skip any images that it already found, but again, if you want to actually play with this device, you maybe want to do a system a day or something like that, then maybe it's easier to do it that way. In either event, once it's done scraping, you can put your SD card back in, and you're going to have images for ROMs, and you can see them all on the device. Okay, so let's do a tour of the operating system now. First thing you're going to see is we have game rooms and RA game. And your first question is going to be, where do you actually launch games from? The answer is it kind of depends. But for any system, and for anybody new to this, I would highly suggest sticking to RA game for basically everything. Game Room is standalone emulators, and you might find some emulators there that you don't have on RA Game, in which case then yeah, your de facto choice is to play it there. But for the most part, just stick to RA Game. It's going to be easier for you to just understand it that way. If you click Start on a game, it's going to add it to Favorites, and you can find it in the Favorites menu on the home screen. For some RetroArch systems, if you push Y on a game, you can choose the core to use to run it. For those playing Game Boy Advance, for example, and you care about how fast forward is, you might want to use GPSP instead of MGBA, and that's one example of why you would change a core. History and search are pretty self-explanatory. App Center has a file manager there, which is a welcome addition, and there's a few niche use cases here, and we're not going to go over them in this video because there's a lot. If you head to Settings, you can adjust the lock screen timer, the backlight brightness, the date and time, and more. Network settings is where you would connect to Wi-Fi if you have the devices with Wi-Fi. One thing that I'm going to disable right away is the button sounds because that drives me nuts. Jumping into a RetroArch game, and if you push the F button at the top of the device, it's going to open the RetroArch menu. The F button is also your hotkey button. You'll find all of this in the manual if you kept it, but F and R2 is fast forward, F and R1 is save state, F and L2 is slow motion, F and L1 is load state, F and start exits the game, F and D-pad left and right will change the save state slot that you're saving to, and F and X will pause the game. F and Y shows the FPS, F and B is for screenshots, and F and volume keys adjust brightness. That's about it, but like I said, check the manual. Now, a very quick tip, because this happens to a lot of people. If you accidentally load a state and you're like, oh God, what did I do? I just lost 40 hours and I loaded at the beginning. Just click the menu button at the top and scroll down and do undo load state. Or, alternatively, if you accidentally saved a state and you just overwrote all of your other progress because you saved the state at the beginning of the game by accident, you can do the same thing. Just push the F button, scroll down, and do undo save state. You're welcome for the people that need that. Now there's some other RetroArch settings that we want to change too. So let's adjust them. From the very main screen of the device, go to Settings, then RetroArch, and start RetroArch. Scroll to Saving. There's two options here. There's Auto Save State and there's Auto Load State. Personally, I like to enable both. This means that when I exit a game, it's going to save the state for me, and when I load a game, it's going to load back to that state automatically. My preference is having this on. You can back out of that menu now, and if you have a device with Wi-Fi, and maybe you want retro achievements, we can enable that now. Head over into User Interface, then Menu Item Visibility, Settings, and make sure that Show Achievements is checked. On some of these devices, it isn't. Then back out to the Settings screen again, and you should now see an Achievements menu. Log in with your Retro Achievements information there, and make sure that Hardcore Mode is disabled. That's kind of it for settings that we need to change. So before you leave RetroArch, head to the main menu on the left, and then Configuration File, and Save Current Configuration. Don't skip this, or all of the changes that we made would just be erased. And we are finally done with this guide. I apologize that it took longer than I thought it would, but hopefully you can just go slowly through it and it helps you get all set up and get everything proper for these devices. Don't forget to like and sub to help the channel grow, and hope you all have a good one.